There you go. Yeah. And,
7 months.
kind of that,
She's 7 months.
something that,
The baby. Eva?
Very good, how are you?
7 months.
can't have 3 of them.
I still gotta bring some. What size is she in?
Yeah.
Tween.
How do you?
I'd have to show you. You got a minute? Yeah.
I'm learning him too.
Thanks.
Oh, it's nice. Did it yes, not? Is it in here?
No, it was not that.
Oh.
I think you got shorted here.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. I signed that guy go over. Okay, let's go here. Did you guys?
Today, 24th or 22nd? To find out what when I was working out, I signed the date.
Right, right.
For me,
Do a
this
lot of
is
documents,
perfect.
you're signing the date 20 times a day and you retire like,
I mean, I saw this, I mean, oh my gosh.
7 months went by. She was born last week.
no. Well, I didn't do something for that. No, nothing real serious.
They just yes, no?
I would ask,
Well, I shouldn't say I thought about it, but then,
Stephanie? Stephanie.
yes, Lord.
These are
Janice.
Oh, you mailed mine? Okay.
You gotta work a lot of hours just to.
I love that.
It's on the mail.
No, you
Yeah, I
mailed
love
the
that.
check.
It's in the mail.
He's emailed? Okay. So if I print it, sign it, send it back by email? Okay.
And besides, it gives you a good excuse when somebody says, "Oh, can you just do one thing?"
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Planning Commission meeting for April the 24th, 2018. If you'll join me for the pledge, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Before we get to scheduled items, I would like to welcome to the Planning Commission Mr. Patrick Zamparelli, a new commissioner. Patrick, welcome aboard.
Thank you.
Hope we can take advantage of your experience for sure. Thank you.
I'll do my best.
Tonight's agenda is going to start with 2 easy ones. We need to approve minutes from the March 13th, 2018 Planning Commission meeting. Chair will entertain a motion.
Second.
Moved and seconded, all in favor?
Mr. Chairman, I have
I'm sorry.
I have some corrections that I'm not going to labor you with, but I'll give them to the recording person and they can make some corrections. There are a lot of run-on sentences on things that I said, and that's understandable when you're trying to take it down from the audio. So if you could just correct it as long as we're doing these things. And before we get to the next one, there's the same thing, there's some corrections, so I would ask that you correct what I said.
Okay, we have a motion. We have it seconded. Commissioner Schuessler has made the point that there are some changes to be made in those minutes, and I'm sure staff will take care of that, so we're going to call for a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
I
Aye.
abstain.
Abstain.
Two abstentions.
I have to abstain. I wasn't here.
That's
right.
You might be right. I think you're right on that one, Pat.
Better safe than sorry.
3 abstentions. And I'm sure that we'll probably have the same thing here, but let's go to item 2018-0291, minutes of the March 27th Planning Commission meeting. Chair will entertain a motion for approval.
So moved. Second.
Moved and seconded, all in favor with Commissioner Schuessler's adjustments that are made on it and notes? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any nays? None. Thank you. We'll go to public hearings now, and this is 2018-0229 Land Development Code Amendment, Section 6-307, signs. And
Yep.
Ms. Stephanie, are you going to be the one?
Yep. Is this on? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tonight, Mitch and I will be presenting this potential amendment to Section 6-307, the sign code. We do have a short presentation for you that goes over some of the broad topics of the sign code amendments before you. We'd like to have some discussion with you tonight and continue this to the next Plan Commission meeting so we can take your feedback from this discussion, incorporate it into another version of the draft, hopefully the final version, and bring that back to you for one quick review, hopefully on May 8th at that meeting before proceeding to committee and board.
Thank you.
So quickly, this presentation goes over why we want to update the sign code, the project timeline, the visual preference survey results, notable changes, and next steps. The last major update was in May of 2011, so it's been a while since we've taken time to update the sign code. There have been some small changes between now and then, but overall it's definitely time to take a look at the sign code, and staff has been working over the last couple years to formulate some better ways to administer this code. The current code is sometimes difficult to navigate. There's inefficiencies or inconsistencies in some parts. There's no graphics or tables, and some of the best practices and local preferences for signage have changed since 2011. There's also some legal issues such as content neutrality, so we really need to update the legal backbone of our ordinance to make sure that we can't get challenged on it. Content neutrality is a big issue, and basically we have to take all of the references to what you can put content-wise on the sign out of the code. The goals are to make it easier to read. We're going to add more graphics and tables, more efficient for staff to administrate. We are going to make sure that the regulations relate to the village's vision, which has to do with that visual preference survey, and Mitch is going to talk more about that in a minute. We want to make sure it's legal, like I said, with the content neutral regulations. We want to make sure it's consistent. So in 2016, staff began discussion and research for potential improvements. In 2017, the research continued, and the visual preference survey was administered. We sent that out to village board members and staff members involved in sign review and sign code, just to get feedback on what we would like signs to look like in the village, to sort of get that aesthetic input. From January till April, which is current, we updated the sign code and drafted and reviewed it internally. We presented the sign code for discussion at the committee meeting last week on the 16th. And tonight we are here at the Plan Commission presenting our draft at this public hearing. We would like to continue it to the May 8th meeting, as I said earlier, to make sure we can show you the final version before going on to committee on May 21st and the board on June 4th. And now Mitch is going to talk about the visual preference survey.
So the visual preference survey was an analysis of a number of different signs and the elements that make those signs good or bad. So this was a survey where the signs that are reflected in the packet and on the presentation here were presented to a number of staff members on the planning side of things, and then also our sign reviewer, and then it was also given to the Board of Trustees. We were then able to take the responses from those surveys and do a statistical analysis and kind of break down what does or what does not make a sign good for Orland Park. So what you're seeing here in the packet is the result of those responses. So what we're going to do is we're just going to quickly go through some of the highlights and some of the lowlights of the results of the visual preference survey. So the first thing here is an overall negative reaction to any sort of electronic message board, any sort of digital signage. Got a consistent negative reaction, and it seems like the the reaction was specifically targeted towards the message boards or the digital signage. On the opposite side of that, we saw a very positive reaction to monument or freestanding identification signs that used natural materials like wood, stone, or even brick, some very sturdy kind of looking materials. As far as wall signs go, we saw a very negative reaction to box signs. Box signs or cabinet box signs are the signs that you see there in the bottom right. That's where you usually have a semi-opaque sign face with some sort of lighting behind it that's enclosed in a box that's usually made out of plastic or wood. We saw a positive reaction, again, to more natural materials, wood, metal sort of wall signs, signs that displayed a sense of authenticity, sort of an urban and modern feel as well. Continuing on with wall signs, we saw a negative reaction to roof signs. Any sign that extends beyond the roof line is sometimes difficult to see. It also does not necessarily look aesthetically pleasing. As far as temporary signs, we saw a negative reaction to banner signs. Temporary materials are banners or flags, anything like of that sort, and anything that was temporary and attached to a permanent structure typically got a negative reaction. A positive reaction was to A-frame or sandwich board signs. Historically, we have not permitted these. So this was an example of something that we saw contradict our code the way that it exists right now. A-frame or sandwich board signs specifically made out of wood, metal materials, non-plastic materials to kind of give that, again, sense of authenticity, sort of a vintage kind of look to it, like a historic downtown feel. We saw a negative reaction to inflatable signs, mainly the air balloons or the giant King Kongs that you see sometimes. That got a pretty negative reaction. And that was something that we do permit right now, and due to the negative reaction, we were taking a look at whether or not we want to continue to permit those. We saw a positive reaction to banner, flag-mounted flag signs that are perpendicular mounted to buildings, and then also banners that are mounted on light poles. Other signs is sort of a category that doesn't necessarily fit into wall, ground, or temporary. We saw a negative reaction. So this is actually a sign that was integrated into the sidewalk in small ceramic tiles. The permanence of that is somewhat dangerous because the business might move, and for that reason we saw a negative reaction to it. We saw an incredibly positive reaction to blade signs. So these are the signs that stick out of the wall, typically around 7 to 9 feet, sort of at the pedestrian scale. This is something that we've only permitted in the downtown district, but due to its positive reaction, we are taking a look at encouraging that in other places across town. We saw a negative reaction to digital signs, specifically behind windows and storefront sort of displays that are meant to grab your attention, whether you want to have your attention grabbed or not. So in the bottom left here, you see some screens behind glass displaying a digital message, and that got a low score. The integration of the sign and the address in the bottom right here got a very positive reaction. Although this is similar to the sidewalk, it's typically used for, in this instance, the address integration into the building itself.
All right, so some notable changes. We have two categories here, minor and major. Some minor ones are that we added a calculation and measurement section so that it's very clear how we calculate things like sign face area, sign height, clearance, window sign coverage, just to make sure that when we're interpreting those, the staff is on the same page. And it's easier also for the sign companies to read how we calculate those as well, so we would get a better submittal from them, hopefully meeting code without any revisions back and forth. We also added a restoration requirement. An example of this is the Michaels building here at 151st and LaGrange. There's what we call ghosting of the previous sign remaining on the building today. That's something that essentially gives them an extra sign because they didn't remove it. And this restoration regulation that we added would essentially mean that you need to get rid of any remnants of past signage, because it's sometimes just a matter of being dirty, and we want to make sure that the facade is always restored to its normal condition. Anytime someone takes a wall sign down, that all the little holes from the mounting get filled in and repainted, and basically restoring the facade to looking normal, like there was never a sign installed. This also applies to a ground sign, making sure that the landscaping is restored or any other elements of that sign are restored to like new condition. The major changes are the reorganization of the sections. We wanted to make sure it's easier to read, not only for staff, for developers, for sign companies. All around, we want to make this code easier. We want to make it so that, like I said, we get the sign companies to submit once and everything meets code, and we don't have a lot of staff time going back and forth reviewing multiple submissions that may need corrections. We are adding graphics and tables, which is new, and it's again trying to make it easier to read and more consistent to administrate. As Mitch mentioned, A-frame signs become allowed, which are these. We want to make sure that we don't get the plastic version of these A-frame signs. They tend to not only look a little less expensive, less creative and unique for the businesses, but they also tend to blow away and get in the way of things easier. So we want something that's a little hardier and more aesthetically pleasing, like these wood or sometimes aluminum frame signs. And box signs would become prohibited. Those are signs, like Mitch had mentioned, in the cabinet here, where you can essentially just take that panel in and out. This one would become prohibited. And this is just for a wall sign. Obviously, you can still have the freestanding signs with the multi-tenant panels that come in and out. And then there's a section for non-conforming signs, so it's very clear that we are not going to be constituting a taking, which is a legal term for taking away rights for someone to make changes to a sign within its usable life. So we couldn't say, here, mall, you can't change your tenant panels on your freestanding sign just because we changed these regulations. Essentially, then they wouldn't be able to change if they had new tenants coming and going, which legally we can't do. So we want to make sure it's very clear that we allow certain changes to signs that don't meet the codes. Go back.
So, as Stephanie had mentioned, one of the things that we tried to do in rewriting this code was making it more user-friendly. A part of doing that was making it more graphically oriented, making it more visually appealing, using some of these sort of graphics to kind of display different things like definitions and also how we calculate measurements. We believe that this would be easier for just your average citizen to go into the sign code and kind of get a feel for, if they're a business owner, what they might be allowed to do with their signage, and then also for sign contractors, it paints a clear picture of how we would calculate the sign face area, which might be slightly different than other towns. This is another example. So this is the definition model that we have in the code right now. This is a pretty clear and easy way of figuring out, okay, I want to put this sign in. You can go to this model and say, oh, a sandwich board, that's number 7. Then you look and you see number 7. You have a pretty clear visual representation of what that sign looks like. And another thing that we decided to do was make a move to what we're calling matrices. So the intent here is for, like I was saying, a business owner, mom and pop shop, or a sign contractor to be able to come in and say, okay, I'm in the commercial district. I exist in one of the commercial zoning districts. I want to put a wall sign on. I want to do an awning sign. And then they just read left to right, and that's where you would find your regulations, rather than searching for it somewhere in a paragraph lost in the middle of the sign code. So these matrices right now are, there are a few things that we'd like to kind of discuss with you to get an idea of how you feel about a couple of different directions that we might go for certain regulations. This is another example of temporary signs, matrices. So this kind of outlines the time, place, and manner. So when Stephanie was saying earlier that there have been recent law changes, there was a 2015 court case, Reed versus Gilbert, Arizona. And the results of that kind of really shook up all of the sign codes across the country, pretty much negated all of them by the ruling saying you can't regulate what's on a sign because a sign is an extension of an expression of freedom of speech. So the content that is on the sign can't be regulated as a part of our land development code. Basically, if you have to read the sign in order to fit it into a certain category, then that's content-based, and that is by nature illegal. So in going back and rewriting the code, I think that was one of the biggest challenges was working around that ruling, and that's what a lot of different places are struggling with right now. And I think that we did a pretty comprehensive job of not making our code content related, but also maintaining sort of a tight grip on the regulations on signage. So this is an example of one of the signs that got a somewhat negative response in the visual preference survey. These are called feather flag signs. You might have seen them in several places around town. So one of the things that we decided to do, going back to this temporary sign matrix, instead of what we have right now, which is sort of a free reign situation, we decided to put a time restriction on these. So what you see here is feather flag signs. The square foot or the sign face area is less than or equal to 15 square feet. You get one per right-of-way frontage. They have to be less than or equal to 10 feet in height, and then you can have not more than 14 days out of the year. You can't have them out for more than 14 days out of the year, 6 times a year. So that, and then they would be not permitted in any sort of public right-of-way. So what we're saying is we're putting restrictions on the time, place, and manner in which they can exist.
And one thing to add to Mitch's comments, as far as content regulation, we can still regulate any sort of indecent comments and content on signs, something that's, you know, not in the interest of public safety as well. So that's about the only thing that's protected as far as what we can regulate. But essentially, you should be able to say, all right, you get 10 square feet, you get 10 square feet, you do, and you do. And that's all we can say is the area that you're allowed. So dimensionally regulating is what we can put most of our regulations on. So going to dimensions, one of the things we want to look at is the formula for calculating sign face area, which is basically the area in which you're allowed to place a sign. So like I said before, it's this magical box, and you're allowed to put your sign within this box that's however many square feet based on basically the size of your building in one way or another. Our current formula is a little difficult at times because it relies on more information. It's 7.5% of the area of the first 2 stories of the building elevation on which it's placed. So as you can see in a couple examples that'll follow here, it can be easy sometimes or it can be difficult sometimes depending on the way that that building has been constructed and the architecture of the building. A possible new formula that many communities use consistently is 1 square foot of signage for every 1 lineal foot of tenant frontage. So we have a couple different examples to show you on how these 2 calculations work and what might be best for us to use going forward. So let's take this simple commercial storefront, just a single tenant building. The current formula showing 7.5% of the building face area equals 21 because we have a 14 by 20 building here. It's 20 feet wide by 14 feet tall. That equals 280 square feet. So 7.5% of 280 is 21. So that's how you figure their allowable maximum sign face area, which you see in that red box there. So in order to be able to do this calculation, you need both the width and the height of the building. And you can see even in this example, the width varies a little bit because you have a little bit wider treatment on the top of the building. You have to rely on the applicant to provide some of those dimensions when they apply for the sign permit. Otherwise, staff has to go into the original building permits, find the original approved elevations in the building permits, and verify on those large plans exactly what was built. So at times, it can be difficult to really accurately get that 7.5%. A possible formula that we could use is that 1 square foot per every linear foot of tenant frontage. This is easy. The building is 20 feet wide. You get 20 square feet of sign face area. You can also check this on our GIS or aerial images pretty simply without having to go into the field. You don't need a ladder to see how tall the building is. You don't have to look at the building plans necessarily. It's a lot simpler for staff to administrate, and it's honestly a lot easier for the sign companies and for the applicants to be able to know what their allowable dimensions are.
Up
Because-
front. Up front, they'll know what right up
Yep.
front. Yeah.
Very easy. So I wanted to show you this also on a larger scale. So this is an actual sign plan for the target location here in Orland Park at 156th and a little bit to the east of LaGrange, as you know. So they're allowed 931 square feet. And the way that we get to this is the height and length of the building. So the majority of the building, and note that the building is different heights through this elevation here. The majority of the building is 28 feet 4 inches high, and the length is 409 feet 1 inch long. That's 11,590 square feet. But the middle portion is a little bit taller, so we have to add another little area in the middle. So it's an estimate that they have another 823 square foot of building face, which the building face area then equals 12,413 square feet. And 7.5% of that is 931 square feet. So again, this is a rough estimate from the plans that they were giving me without having to look way back into all of the particulars, get out my scale, be very accurate. Exactly. So their allowable square footage was 931 square feet. Just to give you an idea, they came in at 900 square feet with this order pickup, CVS pharmacy, and then the Target sign and red background. Now, the possible formula in this case, we know the possible formula would give them 409 square feet based on just the length alone. So in order to make this fair for the larger buildings and for buildings that are set back further, we want to be cognizant that maybe they need a little extra for this formula. So we came up with some parameters. If you have a larger floor area, you get extra square foot per lineal foot at 0.25 and 0.5, depending on your building size. And you're set back from the right-of-way. So if you're set back farther, it's going to be harder to read your sign. So the village recognizes that and would want to consider a bonus for that extra distance so that your sign is still readable. So the maximum possible you could ever have is 2 square feet of signage for every 1 square foot of frontage. You would never get more than that in this scenario. So let me show you how this works out in the target scenario. So like I said before, they are 409 feet and 1 inch long. So the original calculation works out to 409 square feet. That's about half of what they're looking to do on this building. So they get a 0.50 bonus for their floor area because they're more than 50,000 square feet. Another bonus of 0.5 for their building setback because they're more than 300 feet away. And so now they're up at that 2 square feet per 1 square foot of lineal frontage.
They doubled.
Yep. So they get 818 square feet. And again, they were looking for 900 in this. So they'd have to reduce the signage by about 82 square feet, but they could do that easily by reducing that red background 3 feet on either side. And that red background, just so you know, is 14 feet tall by 60 feet wide. So it's a very large sign as it is, and you really wouldn't notice 3 feet inward on either side. So it's pretty comparable, and it keeps everything fair too, because we are considering the setback, we are considering the size of the building, but it's a lot easier for staff to calculate, for the sign company to calculate, overall more accurate in the way that we can administrate it as well. Any questions about this?
Basic math.
Okay.
as far as linear footage and everything, and it doesn't apply to Target or anything, but if somebody had, they've got their structure, their building, but let's just say an extension, they have a pretty large garden center.
Mhm.
And a lot of them are, behind gates. Is that included in the linear footage?
No, those garden centers wouldn't be considered a part of the principal structure. They would be accessory to the principal structure. And the linear frontage would be specific to that specific tenant area of the principal structure.
Brick and mortar.
Yep.
Yeah. Well,
So it's just the building that
If you
would
think
get
of
that.
Lowe's or Home Depot, though, they've got a lot of brick on their side for their garden center. They've got it on the roof. So where would you draw the line?
So if it was an extension of the facade, so if they're brick maintained, so what Stephanie kind of covered a little bit earlier was the sign band. It's that portion of the facade above sort of the main entrance below the roof line where you would typically put a sign. So if that portion of the brick part of the main facade extended onto the garden center, then we would probably classify that as an extension of the facade, and therefore that would probably count towards their total allowable sign area.
I know I'm new, but probably I don't know what that means. So, I'm looking at Home Depot and I'm thinking, it's pretty long.
Yeah.
So-
So,
Go ahead.
yeah, to Mitch's point, if you look at this image here, we call out the sign band. It's kind of that lighter tan color behind Ma's Bakery sign. Typically, most buildings have an area that it's pretty clear to see where the sign's supposed to go. So we would look there and see if that's the ideal place to put the sign. A lot of the time with Lowe's or Home Depot, with their garden center, they might have an area where it's pretty clear they planned a sign, and when we review the building, when it first comes to Plan Commission, sometimes they'll show on their elevations signage in certain places. It's definitely something we could add to the code to clarify one way or the other if we count that, though, if you'd like for us to make that very clear.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
How do these restrictions apply to other municipalities?
The most common thing I've seen is this one-for-one calculation. There's very few communities that do a percentage of the entire facade. One other concern I have with the percentage of the facade is that a tenant can make an improvement to the facade that adds height to the building. Again, using Michael's as an example, if you see the facade of that building, I don't know historically what it looked like before, but it looks as though it was increased recently, and the sign therefore was allowed to be larger. So after the fact, you can almost create a larger sign area by adding to your building upward.
The only reason I was asking, if you're going to get pushback, it's probably going to be from the national companies. They come in and they have their standard sign that they're looking to put on the building. That's why I was asking how our proposed restrictions would relate to what happens in the rest of the country. Are we more restrictive, less restrictive, or about average?
Like in these
As best you know. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously you don't know without doing some kind of a survey, but
Yeah, and we did look at many other communities and how they administrate sign face area in their codes. Like I said, the most common is using a square foot per lineal foot formula. Some use 1, some use 1.5 per every 1 foot. It varies by community, but when comparing our measurements, we found it most similar to just go 1-for-1. And you can see in the small scale example, it's 1 square foot different in this case because the current formula was 21 square feet, whereas this formula is 20 square feet. In the Target example, it had a little bit more difference, but we also accounted for that with those bonuses.
So is this proposed formula pretty similar to what you see in other
Yes.
municipalities? The
Yes.
1 square foot per 1 lineal foot. So we're kind of in the middle, is what you'd say?
Yes.
The one-to-one is pretty standard. The additional bonuses is less common, but if anything, that would only incentivize larger signs, which would make those companies a little
Less
bit happier. I would say that this sort of regulation for sign face area is specific to suburban areas where you have larger tenant spaces with lower elevations. So because we have these, junior big box stores that are set back, offering these additional incentives will help them a long way in providing a more accurate amount of sign face area.
So I have a question. If you start getting into mixed-use buildings where you have residential, apartments or condos above, so you're still, that's where you can run into trouble with the,
Right, yeah. So right now in our code, it's one of the biggest holes, I guess, in our code right now is addressing multi-tenant solutions, especially on different stories. And this is something that would sort of really synergize well with something like that.
Yeah, and on that note, some communities I've seen for second story or anything above the first story will actually say that whole story as a whole is allowed 1 for 1, 1 square foot per linear foot. And so even if you have 5 tenants, they have to share that same sign allotment essentially. So that's one way to administrate it that we could put into the code.
Backing up just a little bit, we were talking about linear footage and, like a Lowe's and a garden center. That one important consideration maybe is that, places that have these centers like that, they don't have a permanent roof on there. In the garden centers, it might be open air, it might be tin, and that could be a restricting factor.
So I did want to jump back to that a little bit. So to use a for instance, you have Home Depot, and then I'm not entirely sure if this is the case, but as extending from the facade, you transition to, we'll say, wrought iron metal gate.
Yeah.
That is not an extension of the facade because it does not match the original building materials, and it doesn't maintain the sign band, which we were talking about a little bit earlier. But if you had, we'll say, a Lowe's, even if it had that metal gate on the bottom, but they were to continue that brick feel around the top and then have brick pillars in the corners, and they were to maintain that sign band, I would say that is an extension of the facade.
I'd ask Mitch if I could say, probably it's not heated, so those little line areas, they're not heated. So if you just kind of took that into consideration too,
And there's also a restriction on the number of signs too. So if they want a sign over the main entrance that says Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever store it may be, they wouldn't necessarily always get a second sign to go over Garden Center too. So there is a limit to the number of signs.
Can I ask a question on the multi-story thing that Commissioner Murphy raised? There's a building in town, I think it's called the Atrium Office Building. It's on 151st Street on the south side across from Sheehy Funeral Home. It's a 2-story commercial office building that has an atrium in the center. Right now they have, I believe, box signs for probably 8 tenants. Under this formula, the ones on the second floor would have to share the 1 square foot for every lineal foot with the ones on the first floor, is that correct? So maybe those second floor tenants wouldn't get a sign then?
So the proposed formula potentially in this case, let's say it's this building and you just have a second floor added on top of this. So the tenant on the first floor would get 20 square feet, and then everyone on the second floor would share another 20 square feet. Does that make sense? So say you have 2 tenants on the second floor, they each would get 10 square feet.
in a 20-foot span.
Double the space.
If it's
Yes.
Okay, well, in this particular building I'm talking about, the second floor is the same as the first floor. So whatever the first floor has, the second floor would have also then, right?
Correct.
Okay.
But you would just divide it by the number of tenants. So each floor gets the same, but you divide it by the number of tenants.
So,
So one tenant on the first floor gets 20, and then tenant number 2A gets 10, and 2B gets 10.
I think in that building, there's the same number on each floor. It's
Okay.
like 4 and 4, I think,
Gotcha.
or 5 and 5.
On a first floor, typically, when you have multi-tenant buildings, they each have, a storefront entrance. The trouble with multi-tenant situations where the tenants are on the second floor is
They share an entrance.
Not only that, but one tenant could be occupying the entire front facade, and like the orientation of the actual tenant spaces might not necessarily line up with the orientation of the main entrance of the building. So when you're splitting it up and saying linear foot of tenant space, that might not necessarily translate in a multi-tenant situation on the second floor. So
How
that's
does
why
it-
you just take it and divide it
Makes sense.
evenly.
How does it affect, we don't see it now, but as we look at the I-80 corridor and some of that, where you're going to have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-story buildings, probably, we talk about linear tenant space. How is that going to be calculated as far as when you've got not just this way, but quite a bit going that way? Because
So
would the
this would
signs
actually-
be all on the, would the signs be going up, or would they all be on the first or second floor? How would that be done?
Well, so that's one of the things that we could put a limit on the total number of signs allowed per facade. So even if it was a 6-story building with, we'll say, 8 different tenants, we could say the maximum number of signs is 4 or 6, whatever we kind of see in other codes. Again, this is something that our code doesn't address right now, and it's something that is going to be arbitrary no matter what number we kind of put to it. It's more so what you guys and what the village board thinks would be the best.
Doesn't the present code encourage a single sign designating a name for the building, like the Jones Complex with an address, and
Yeah,
then
so-
everybody gets to the Jones Complex and they just have to find their way around?
So we do have that in the code right now. We require the main tenant to be the name of the plaza. We removed that after we ran into a couple situations where that was kind of hamstringing us. And we have one notorious situation, the Beggars Plaza sign. I don't know if you've seen that up on 143rd. That sign actually reads Beggars Plaza, but I've looked at it 5 times, and every single time I read it as Beggars Pizza, even though it says Beggars Plaza. And there are a number of different times where we've had people come in and apply for sign permits, and they've always questioned that regulation as to what the logic was for that.
And we also can't regulate content anymore. So we can't say you have to say this plaza. We can certainly encourage that because, it's easy to say, oh, go to Orland Crossings or Orland Square Mall and we're at that location. But we can't specifically say that's the only thing you can put on your sign or you have to put that on your sign.
I have a question on the content, because I review signs for retail shopping malls on a daily basis, and we always have, and it may be just because the landlord has this regulation, but I'm curious, one of our stipulations is it always has to match the DBA, doing business as, the trade name, their legal name in their lease. So can you regulate it per the lease?
We cannot. So the discrepancy is, as long as it's not misleading, so the rule that they put to it is, the actual rule is that, does it support a governmental interest? Meaning, does it support the welfare of the community at large? And is the regulation narrowly tailored to achieve that end? Meaning, is the regulation that you put on it specific enough that it can't be broadly interpreted? It has to be specifically about what you're trying to say. So with that being said, we can say things like similar to how the FCC regulates. You can't say, swear words, or you can't have indecent, anything like that, because that supports a governmental interest. But the discrepancy between the DBA and the actual name of the business on the sign isn't necessarily a strong governmental interest. There is a governmental interest there, but it's something that, unless it's intentionally misleading and is doing harm to the community, it's not something that we can regulate necessarily.
But a property manager or a property owner working with their tenant might have a little bit more room for negotiation with the
criteria,
sign.
right,
The
okay.
village can't enforce content regulation, but a property owner can always be more particular than our code when it comes to aesthetics for the sign.
Okay, thank you.
Do any of these limitations, infringe, step back, we were talking about the atrium and had multiple tenants. Well, a lot of, I'm thinking, there's a lot of buildings in the area. For instance, all of the businesses in the Ravinia office complex there, they have nice monument signs. And the monument will have a listing of all the businesses in there, and they vary, you know. Some of them are plastic inserts and some, you know. But this whole idea about how much signage a business is allowed, does that infringe upon a monument sign?
No, so the monument sign, the multi-tenant monument signs would actually stay very similar to what it is right now. So what we were talking about before was strictly the wall signs. The freestanding identification signs, the way that we actually have it right here. So down at the bottom, towards the bottom, you see ground signs, monument signs. And then we're going to look at non-residential, multi-tenant signs. And then the relevant part is all the way over to the right. You see the font is different on the computer that we did this on. But on the far right there, it says listing of tenant names shall continuously occupy 80% of the sign face area. So however they want to divvy that up, whereas before it was 60-40, so 80% of the sign face area. So we'll say this piece of paper right here is the sign face area. Previously and currently, 80% of this would have to be covered in the tenants' names. Of that 80%, 60% of that had to be dedicated towards a primary tenant. So that's where we got sort of the plaza regulation from. The remaining 40% could be divided into however many tenants there were. So now we got rid of that 60-40, and now we just have the 80%, and we're leaving the discretion up to the landlord how they divide up that 80%.
You mentioned Target previously. What was their response to
Interesting point.
your new ordinance that I mean, you're trying to get them to comply with the new ordinance because it's going to be going into effect. What was their response to?
So at the time that we reviewed Target, it was about a month and a half ago, and it wasn't relevant at the time to try and get them to comply with this ordinance because they wanted to get their approval sooner than June. But they would have just had to make that minor modification of 6 feet to the width of that red area to comply. So in their scale, it wouldn't have made a huge visual difference for them to comply with the code. And we may have some nonconformities just based on the existing signs today, but that's why we wanted to make sure the nonconformity section of the code clearly states that we're not going to be taking away any rights to the existing signage. You're still allowed to basically make changes up to 50% of the value of the sign.
So they're going forward on the existing code then?
Yes, because they already submitted. Anyone that submits while the current code is still in
Sure.
place is regulated by that
It just
code.
becomes non-conforming once the new code goes into effect.
Correct.
So the non-conforming section that is in the code does favor keeping signs that are non-conforming. It's just when the tenant owner or the property owner or whoever comes in to do a completely new sign, then they would come into conformance. But we're not going to make people take down their signs just because we're passing this code.
20 years ago, the village prohibited pole signs. Look around,
Yeah.
there are a lot of pole signs because they're still standing there 20 years later. So it's going to be a long haul to get this particular change implemented village-wide. Probably not in my
Luckily,
lifetime.
As far as LaGrange Road goes, we're seeing a lot of those businesses that had to remove their freestanding identification signs as a result of the LaGrange Road widening. They're starting to come back in. They're starting to pull sign permits to put those signs back in. So hopefully this would be in effect by the time that those kind of come back around.
Some of them just dug in and they put the old sign back up.
Yeah,
Which they had the right to do. They just
You're right.
took it down, stored it for a year, and then they applied for a permit to put it back up,
Yep.
which they have the right to do.
Yeah, so that
Any
was very common.
regulation on the first strip center? Is there any regulation if the property owner does not regulate it, if they don't have criteria, or if they don't enforce it, for placement of signs? So if you have 5 that they're sort of all placing them at the,
Yep, so one of the things we are making sure to add into the design standards in the new sign code is a center line being established so that you don't get the sign here and then there and then there and then, you know, when feasible, we'd like for you to center the sign over the door because then it's easier to direct the customer to the door. But architecturally, sometimes it doesn't work out. An example is maybe like Art Van Furniture. It's kind of off to the side from the front door, but architecturally, it's meant for that location. So definitely we want to see people aligning horizontally, or I'm sorry, vertically, where the signs should be on the facade.
great, thank you.
So we do have, just for reference, this is subsection E, permanent signs, and then within that, number 1, appearance standards, which is similar to the design standards that we have in the Land Development Code 6-308, but this is specific for signs. It kind of regulates, like Stephanie was saying, the location and orientation and sort of all those aesthetic, behind the scenes kind of regulations for where signs go.
You had some rather negative comments about digital electronic signs when you gave your introductory remarks. I don't see anything in here that says they're prohibited.
There's a section for prohibited signs in the sign code, and it explicitly says electronic signs.
And that was a result
Where
of
is that?
That should be. So that's under subsection H, prohibited signs.
And number 9 says, any signs or attention-getting devices that rotate, revolve, or have any visible moving parts that gives the appearance of movement, including but not limited to searchlights, spinners, streamers, balloons, or other similar devices, or ornamentation designed for the purposes of attracting attention, promotion, or advertising, unless otherwise provided for in this section. And then number 14 clarifies by saying electronic, blinking, flashing, or hologram signs.
Okay.
I think you'd made mention earlier regarding vacancy signs in the event that a storefront is vacant. How would you treat that?
So are you referring to the banner signs that we were talking about earlier? So that's something that, even though it did get a negative reaction, we understand that there's a business need for those sort of signs. So we're not taking them out of the code right now. We're just kind of leaving them as is.
So it's considered a real estate sign, and the regulations for that are on page 7 of 20 in the draft that we gave you, the clean copy of the draft. And it basically says you're allowed a sign when you have real property which is actively being offered for sale or lease. So again, we can't regulate that it's a for sale sign or a for lease sign, but you're allowed a sign, and what you put on it is hopefully in your best interest of trying to get occupancy. And so there's certain standards you have to meet, setback requirement. You get 1 sign per frontage. You may have it no earlier than 30 days before and must be removed 7 days after the close of a transaction of the sale or rental. Shall not be above the roof line when it's on the building. And there's a maximum sign face area per sign in accordance with the size of the land. So it goes from 6 square feet to 40 square feet as the maximum, depending on the amount of acres.
How do you know when it's going to be 30 days before it closes?
It's very hard to enforce, but
I mean, something becomes vacant. You put up a sign that it's vacant or for sale. You don't know when it's going to sell. I've seen signs up for years on some of these things. I mean,
so what we can do is we can enforce the location and the size of the sign and make sure that it is within those parameters.
does it make sense to even have it on the books if we're not going to be able to enforce it? Just
It
not
does,
even
so
have
that
not even have it on there.
Sometimes you'll see signs that are 100 or 200 square feet, and we don't want the
Length of
blight
time
of that
you're
look
talking
of
about.
sign.
I mean, the length of time, not the size or the scope of the sign itself.
So the length of time is something where, in multiple cases, it's like you said, it's very hard to enforce. And
Why
that's
even have
absolutely true. The point is that if you note, thank you. After a period of time, if you notice that a sign has existed and it's creating a negative influence on maybe a shopping center, creating air quotes blight, then you can note that that day the sign was there, and then you can track from that day. It's more so a point of code enforcement. It sort of gives the teeth to the regulation. But again, if you have an opinion on it, we can certainly take a look at it.
And Commissioner Paul, also it's related to the provision of it being a real estate sign. Again, we can't regulate the content, but the duration of it is related to the sale. So we have to somehow regulate, what the sign is for and the purpose of the sign to be able to say you can have that sign for essentially that purpose.
The other thing too is, as far as temporary signs, I noticed on that matrix, if you want to go back to that, I don't know if this was a typo or if I'm just reading it wrong. Duration, okay, not more than 14, the number 14, the word 14, days at, can't read that clearly, but then not more than 6, the number 6, the word 4 times a year.
That was a typo. That will be corrected.
Okay, I
So the intent is 6 here. We just need to update that language.
didn't know if I was missing something.
Yeah, we
That's
actually.
about 1/4 of the year, though, right?
I'm sorry, what was that?
If you do the math, it's about 1/4 of the year that could have those signs up.
Yeah, so I believe we did that. It was close to 20-25% of the year. So that's a good portion of the year. It sounds more restrictive than it is.
Yeah, and we wanted to go with 6 instead of 4 in order to be more business friendly.
I'm curious because my real estate office, there's been a sign there for 7 years, but there is a vacancy in the building. But it's kind of annoying to me, honestly. It's not my sign. No, it sits there and it's kind of like, I would have thought they were violating some sort of ordinance.
So that's kind of what I was talking about earlier. If we do ever get a complaint that it is, again, air quotes, blight, that is creating a negative impact on somebody's business, then we would go out and we would note, okay, the sign exists on this day. We would wait 30 days, and then that restriction on the days, that's the teeth that gives code enforcement. Your sign has exceeded the maximum allowable amount of days, and then they have something to lean against and say, you now have to remove that sign. Whereas otherwise it would be open-ended.
But there is a vacancy, so I'm kind of, I'm
Yeah,
conflicted with it myself, so I don't want to make a complaint. No.
Yeah. After that amount of time too, I would think they would have had to do some maintenance to the sign. So we'd also take a look at it from a maintenance perspective. If the sign's falling apart, we would ask that they repair it. So at least you don't have a ill-maintained sign in front of your business.
It was blown over for about a year, and I was really ready to call because I thought it really looked
Please
terrible.
do.
Yes.
Please do.
But it's fixed now.
Under the present code, the car dealers on 159th are allowed larger signs. Is that going by the wayside?
So they're allowed the taller signs for the freestanding identification sign. It's not necessarily going by the wayside. It's something that we can certainly take a look at.
I don't care if it goes by the wayside.
As of right now, it's something that is not carried over into the new code.
Okay.
Going back to the electronic signs, was that mainly a village board consensus that they didn't want to have? In the past, there have been a lot of discussions about electronic and digital signs with differing opinions of different trustees and mayors. So what you showed in your survey, was that mainly the village board that felt that way, or was it the staff?
So
both?
we did have a number of staff and then, like I had said, the village board take the visual preference survey. I think in total we had 23 respondents to the visual preference survey, and that score of the 2 out of 10 was pretty consistent among a good majority of the survey respondents. And to go back to the reasoning for the lack of carrying over the height increase for auto dealers, that's something that is potentially content-based. allowing certain regulations, allowing certain bonuses for land uses is somewhat content-based on its face. And the way that the code exists right now is actually not content-based because it restricts them by putting almost like an overlay district on it. It says 159th between, I believe, 94th and 76th.
The whole rationale was they're allowed larger signs on the Tinley side, so we'll allow larger signs on the Orland side. That was as simple as that.
Yeah, so in order to kind of get away from picking certain land uses to have sign bonuses, we chose not to incorporate that into the new code.
Okay.
And if I could go back to one comment, Commissioner Schuschler, you had mentioned before removal of non-conforming signs and those pole signs that have been there 20 years. The committee, when we discussed this last week, did bring up that topic as well, and they had questioned whether there's a way we can get those non-conforming signs brought into conformance. Some other communities do use a incentive program to basically provide funding, kind of a matching funding sort of mechanism to get rid of those signs. But like I mentioned earlier, it is a taking if you full-on require that they remove them before the end of their usable life, and you have to track their amortization schedule to know what their usable life really is, and it's very difficult to administrate that for all the signs that we have in town.
The other thing is some people covertly improve their sign without getting a permit. So although the sign is deteriorating, they go out there and very quietly rebuild the guts of it. And then the question is, well, how come your pole sign's still there? Oh, it's still hanging in there, there's no problem with it. But they've rebuilt the inside of it, and you didn't know it.
Yeah. And if we see it happen, we can definitely report it and make note that they're doing work without a permit. But it's those times that we can't see
Sure.
every sign everywhere.
Yeah, you can't be everywhere.
So we'll do our best, and we're going to be discussing options for how we might be able to bring signs into conformance in the future, whether there will be potentially funding available for that type of thing, if it can be part of a program that we have currently for property improvements. So that'll be something we address.
Well, I raised questions regarding digital signs. I don't like flashing signs. I don't like banding signs. I don't like signs that change every minute or 5 minutes. But when this came up 3 years ago when I was on the village board, I said, I think there's a place for it. The technology is there. And why can't we regulate digital signs the same way we regulate regular signs? And we can say no flashing, no banding, can't change it more than once every 24 hours. It can only be a certain brightness. You can't have multicolors. And I think there were like 20 different restrictions proposed, but still the majority of the board didn't want to go that route. So, but I don't like some of the digital signs that we see in adjoining communities. Well, number one, I think it's a safety hazard. When you got these things flashing all the time, people can get distracted from their driving, and in that sense, it's bad.
So there have been a good number of advancements in digital signage in recent years, especially with advancements in LED technology. It's making digital signage much more cost-effective and easier to sort of manipulate. One of the good things about the way that we rewrote the code was that if in a couple of years, if the opinion changes for whatever reason, it's very easy to sort of plug and play different regulations into the code. So if, like you were saying, you wanted to say one change in message per 24 hours or certain restrictions on how bright they can be, signage.
Multicolors.
Yeah, all
Banding.
of those sort of things. It's very
Flashing.
easy to sort of incorporate that into the matrix here. So it's more so just not only that, but pretty much any type of sign that we talked about, cabinet box signs. If the opinion ever changes on any sign, it's very easy to sort of incorporate those regulations back into the code.
Could you consider it now? I'm just more curious because I used to run a restaurant. And I thought, wow, how nice it'd be to just be able to sit there and program my next month's messages I want to put out there. I'm kind of surprised we don't allow it. When I seen them, they got a negative vote I was surprised. It seems like we're going backwards.
Certainly, it could be considered. Like we discussed here a few minutes ago, there would need to be a lot of regulations to make sure it's done in an aesthetically pleasing and tasteful manner. There are some communities that regulate it more or less, and you can really tell the quality of the sign by how bright it is, or how often it flashes, or if there's videos and colors and pictures, and often it is a safety hazard. So we'd want to make sure to look at all those different aspects to make sure that it's done in an aesthetically pleasing way.
I agree. I remember, I think Orland Hills had a bright one. Going down 159th Street, it was dangerous. So, but just changing a message.
Yeah, I think the concern here is that in the preference survey, the opinion was very strongly swayed toward a negative opinion of them, and we took our direction from that survey. So going forward, we would need to make sure that the elected officials on the village board are in support of that type of sign.
Who was surveyed in general?
The village board and staff in the Development Services Department that reviews signs or works with the sign code or development projects.
So no business owners?
No business owners at this time. If this is something that you all are in favor of exploring in greater detail, then certainly, perhaps not for this code update, but for an adjacent land development code update, we can sort of go into a little bit more comprehensive study and maybe do some white papers, some report, and take a closer look at whether or not the community and some of the stakeholders in the community would support digital messaging.
I just
Well,
think,
not-
yeah, it would be interesting to hear what some of the business owners in Orland have to say, just, specifically with this discussion of the electronic. Again, I'm in the mall business, and, years ago, there was no electronic signs, period. And now we require, like, all menu boards, for example, in food courts and such, to be, electronic. Again, with many stipulations on what can be accepted, but just food for thought, going forward.
Well, the difficult part, it's inherently subjective to begin with. And that's the most difficult part, the subjectivity of it, and how you can harness all that and
Yeah.
develop one sensible code.
And I'll tell you from experience, it is very difficult to make sure that every electronic sign in the community really doesn't change except for every 8 seconds, and really is a certain level of brightness, and really doesn't have 12 colors per message.
Now,
You know,
you have 30,000 staff to go out and check that, correct? 30,000.
Exactly.
Well, and electronic, though, it can be static. It doesn't necessarily, like, if we were to
It could
allow
be.
electronic, but not allow moving or flashing.
You could certainly ask that they do that.
Mr. Hoda?
They don't always comply.
So I'd like to share a couple experiences. For example, Village of Bolingbrook allows electronic signs. And so during election season, just in the last season, that was a contentious season as well. And many of the signs turn into a political statement, basically. And nobody could control that. I live in Bolingbrook. I saw that for, actually say, for a couple months or so, that many of the businesses turn their signs into a political statement and supporting or opposing whatever that case may be. So I think that's another reason that we should consider when we are looking at electronic signs in our village, because these things will come along, and like our staff said, that content cannot be controlled even if it's not a political or election season. It could be done anytime at your convenience. So that's one reason I think
Does Bolingbrook allow the signs to be changed frequently as the owner of the sign wants?
I do not know the exact regulations, but I did see, as I drive in and out every day as I live there, that signs were changed, I will say, every 3-4 days, that it was a different message, just different words on it that were supporting or opposing a candidate. Second part I'd like to make, we have tried to cover as many possibilities of a sign as possible in our code, but it is practically impossible to have every possible permutations that is maybe exist, or the buildings that may come in the future. So this is why there will be modifications, will keep coming to you over time, but not, hopefully not as a major overhaul like we're doing it now. It's a very tedious, time-consuming effort over weeks and weeks and months that takes away our time from providing the development services that we could offer, but it is also an important part of our service, so we are focusing in that as well. So minor changes I expect will be coming to you as we come across that challenges us with something that we are unable to handle on a regular basis, then we will bring it back to you. But I expect that the overall sign code should stand for some years with minor modifications, as I said before.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
My personal feeling is you should get some input from the stakeholders, and the stakeholders in this case are the businesses. The residents are concerned for aesthetic reasons, and that's why we have the existing sign code, because we didn't want huge, gaudy, loud signs. We wanted to project a different image for the town. But the businesses have a need for signage, and they are stakeholders. We might not, staff and Plan Commission and the Village Board might not agree with everything they say, because sometimes businesses just want the biggest sign they can get, the biggest, the widest, the brightest, whatever. And we're not necessarily going to allow that, but we should reach out to them, as I mentioned to you before the meeting, through the Chamber of Commerce or other avenues that you have, to find out if there are any ideas from the business community with regard to what's being proposed. We probably won't agree with everything that's being proposed, but we should, at the end of the day, be able to say that we were open to suggestions.
You'd have to be in a position to get that document in front of you to 400 or 500 businesses. You'd be in a position to do that, because they're going to have to look at it to comment on it. So be prepared to do that.
Well, you can make it available to the Chamber of Commerce. They've got 500 members, so they can tell anybody that's interested to come and, come to the next meeting and have your say.
We'll see if we could accommodate that request in the next couple weeks.
Is that something they could post to Chamber of Commerce? I mean, would there be, your working document for feedback from the chamber members?
So this is publicly available, and our revised version, based on the comments that we have tonight, will be available. We'll make it available, and we will also be sure that it's made very evident that you can take a look at the sign code and sort of look at the stuff that we're proposing here. So.
The Chamber has a website. They could put it on their website.
And
Some people will find it of interest, others could care less.
Yeah, and that's key for continuing this public hearing, so that if someone does have a comment, we can continue to hear those comments on the May 8th meeting.
If I can say something, I remember a few years ago, I thought the chamber was approached on the sign ordinance. Cloran Putman, am I wrong?
It's entirely possible. I've been here 2.5 years.
Oh, okay.
Stephanie's been here, and Krishit have been here a little bit shorter than that. So I know that they were looking at it. I think it was in 2013 when they first started taking a look at the sign code.
Yes, it was 2013, 2014, and there were some chamber members that came to the village board meeting to indicate what their thoughts were on it.
I'd be willing to bet that version of the sign code sort of was left by the wayside due to turnovers and staff. I know that we do have some historic documents from when they were going through that. I'll gladly take a look and see if we have any sort of feedback from the chamber or any other feedback that's incorporated in there.
Sure, give you direction.
Absolutely.
Of course, you're never going to...
Talk to your director. She was present for all of those tedious discussions, and she can tell you that it was a pain to go through it and then have it shot down at the end. So.
The fact of the matter is, it's good to have the stakeholders in there, but practically speaking, you're never going to accommodate everybody, which is why it's so important
This guy,
to do some of the things you've done, and to provide graphs, and to provide charts, and to make it as broad and flexible as you have.
I think you did a great job. I think making it simpler was a great thing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
we need to take care of one official part of business. This is a public hearing.
Yep.
So I have to offer John Q. Public, place is mobbed, an opportunity to speak. There are none. As I read next steps, your request is to continue this to the May 8th Planning Commission meeting. Unless there is more in
Yes.
your report, I'm
I do
thinking.
have one more fun part
okay,
for you.
excuse me. Let
I
me see.
promise we won't
Let me
take too
put a
much
line
longer.
through this.
And this could just be food for thought to come back to us the next time. But we wanted to, let's see, we've already been through this. We wanted to bring up design standards for multi-tenant panels, and this was not discussed in the draft. By the way, thank you again for reading through all the sign code. I know it probably took a while, and it's very in-depth, and I appreciate all the discussion we're having tonight about it. Multi-tenant signs. So we have some options here to consider, and this is something that really makes an impact on the aesthetics for signs. These different options show basically loose regulations to tight regulations from option A to option D. Other communities have adopted similar standards to these based on the aesthetic preferences for that specific community. And right now, I believe we do not regulate anything like the background color, font color, or font on a sign. Some communities like to encourage what we talked about earlier about using just the name of the center. And so, like option D, it would be more incentivized to use the name of the center than the tenant branding on the different sign panels. Again, this is the preference of whatever community visually, how they want to present the signs. But going forward, I think for our design standards, we should consider having some consistency with the panels, because it's actually sometimes a safety hazard to have option A because you have so much going on the sign. And I know you're probably looking for the brand that you're trying to get to in your car, but it can be a lot of colors and fonts all at once. So I'd like to see if anyone has any opinions, either now or potentially at the next meeting, if you'd like to think about it, on what regulations might be appropriate for Orland Park as far as these panels.
I would say, A or B. I mean, companies put a lot into their branding, the colors, the font, to make themselves stand out. I mean, you can see some of these businesses without actually reading the sign. You know what they are because of the font and the colors. That's an advantage, I think. I mean, the ones at the end, I mean, I don't know what good those even do. I mean, why even have them there? I would say the first or the second one, because at least you're incorporating the font and the colors that people know. I mean, there's, again, especially if it's a specific business that you're looking for when you're driving, you'll pick up on that right away. You're not going to sit and read that last one. You're going to stop at every strip mall and try to read through that. That's a disaster. I would say the first two. That's just my opinion.
Commissioner Paul, I think it would be more dangerous driving trying to read the two on the right, C and D, than it would be to read A and B. I mean, you really got to stare at,
That's what I'm saying. I mean, you could look at the.
That's funny because I like C, and I was thinking for older people. I think there's some sort of they say that there's different font for people as they're getting older, seniors, in a different background. I do. I think when you look at people, they have a hard time reading signs. I'd like C.
Well, you might be surprised, but
I'd agree, I'd go with C.
I
You give the company
concur with
the
you.
option to use the particular font they want, but you've got a uniform color in the background.
I was for C as well.
Okay.
And, as far as driving by, I mean, a lot of these monuments, it's not something you drive by. You know where you're going. Generally, you pull up to it. And aside from font color, you don't mention font size or font style. I don't know how granular you want to get, but personally, I like C as well.
And
You know,
my 2 cents are C. Again, working for a bunch of different landlords, when you have a national tenant who can do a great job on a color and a logo, and then you have sometimes a mom and pop who just, it's horrible. So you have to be really careful with that. And going all the way to D, that gives them no individuality.
Pretty
So,
plain Jane.
it's a monument sign, they have to maintain the black and white, and then they can go with their colors and their logo and all their branding on their main sign. And that's typically how, the bigger landlords are handling it for the shopping centers.
If I could jump in and say another thing, from this angle, when you're down here, it's actually harder to read the burger joint on the side angle. I can see it on the two on the right, but when I'm looking off over here, burger joint's not as clear. No, get out of here.
I was going to say, Mr. Zephyr, you're old.
I know.
But if it was a burger joint of a brand that you knew, you'd pick up.
I'd be okay with B or
absolutely.
C.
Yeah.
I would be against, I'd oppose A and D.
Two extremes.
Right. Middle of the road kind of guy.
The thing that I like is Eddie's Shoe Shine store is going to get the same square feet as Burger King on those kinds of signs.
It's up to the landlord how they,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Allocate.
They divvy it up.
disperse their sign face area to the tenants, but there's advantages to each one of these, but based on your comments, the favorite here is C with B at a close second. So when we draft this, I can draft it as though option C is in the code, and we can talk about it some more next time. So if you want to give it some more thought, look around, the community, not only Orland Park, but other adjacent communities or wherever you may go here and there throughout the week, and see if you notice this on other signs, and see if you notice if it really does make a difference with your visibility, with your safety, with the overall aesthetics of the sign, because I'd be curious to see your thoughts in an actual real-life application of this.
And that's the other thing, whether you guys want to or not, you're going to see signs everywhere now. That's all you're going to notice
yeah.
driving down the street. So for the next few weeks, soak it all up, and
Sorry about that.
yeah, it happens.
All right, so if there's any other sections of the code you want us to go over tonight, or if you have any other discussion topics that you would like to talk about, or any questions, we're happy to answer and discuss anything.
If this were adopted without a single change, it would be a tremendous improvement over what is there right now, so good job.
Agreed, yeah, nice job,
Thank you.
nice job.
Book it, Dano. Book it, Dano. Oh, they wouldn't know.
They wouldn't even know who Dano is.
Too young.
Dano, it's really old.
What
It's
does
an
that mean?
old, it's an old
A
saying.
Wi-Fi bulb.
It's in the bag. Book it. Yeah. What series was that?
They have Hawaii
Wi-Fi
5.0.
Hawaii 5.0, yeah.
The new one.
There's a new version of
Right.
Wi-Fi.
Look at their faces when I said Hawaii 5.0.
Just one more general comment on the different signs, really tremendous job. It's an awesome task and to quantify,
Don't use the word but.
like you did. But, as far as the signs themselves go, it's difficult because it's so subjective, but just in a couple of instances, I'm looking in here, and, you might like a certain type of material and everything, and think you like wood and whatnot, but I think one of the considerations should be how will this signage, whatever you're going to use, withstand the elements. And as far as different kinds of signs, I just noticed you had one towards the back, it was very low rated, and it was, I don't know, it's ice cream or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
The very end,
Blade color.
you gave it, you gave it a 4, not too awful. But there are businesses that have their trademark. Might be like Andy's frozen custard.
So I'm sorry. The
It might be
negative
the
reaction
trademark of
to
Freddy's.
this. Yeah, and we called these literal signs. I believe I called. There's on the next page a fish, where the sign is, the shape of the sign is representative of the thing that they're selling. That was not the negative reaction. The negative reaction to that one specifically was the neon. The exposed neon is what sort of drew the score down. This was by far the most divisive sign in the visual preference survey. People loved it, people hated it, and because it happened that way, it wound up with a 4, pretty much close to the middle.
And on one of the pages, you even had I don't know what the purpose was. You had a van, a moving decal. We're not suggesting that we're going to regulate what somebody puts on a private vehicle.
So a vehicle that is used for day-to-day operations, no, because they're not parked in one specific area. What we were trying to kind of pull from that specific image was a van or trailer or any of those sort of vehicles that are parked in front of a business that display the sign, and they're clearly parking it out front for the intent of using it as signage. That's what we were trying to avoid. There's no real issue with Joe Schmo's plumbing being plastered onto a van and him using that as his work van. We're saying just don't paint a full mural on your van and then park it right in front of the road
And use it as
overnight.
a freestanding sign.
And
Right.
they buy an old truck that hardly runs, and it never moves out of the
parked
parking lot.
Sure, sure.
So the specific regulation that talks about vehicle signs is listed under prohibited signs on page 16 of 20 in this draft, and I'll read it for you. It's number 8.
Yes.
And it says, commercial signs on a vehicle where said vehicle is parked adjacent to or near the right-of-way for the purposes of identifying or calling attention to the business. So basically trying to use it as an additional sign.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Yep, such as utilizing directional signage and is not used for daily operations or during the regular course of business, or is not licensed, insured, or operational. So again, going back to basically just using a sign on a vehicle as a sign, rather than, like I know we all see the Nothing But Cakes van driving around town, which has a lot of advertising on it. Essentially, they would just need to park that to the rear of the building.
Sure.
Makes sense.
Thank you.
I'm
Makes
thinking,
sense.
may I say that? I'm thinking the American Family Insurance, they were right down the street here, on, right across from Crystal Street. You know, he had a nice little Cooper, Mini Cooper, and it looked great. And he did drive it. But 99% of the time, that thing sat there as an additional sign. But I didn't think it was bad.
Yeah, we would just ask if we see them or receive complaints that they park in the back of the building or not in the most visible spot from the right-of-way if possible. So again, it's hard because sometimes those spots aren't available, but if we do notice that it's an ongoing occurrence or that there's complaints, we do need to address it.
The danger is the precedent that it sets. If one person does it, then everybody's going to want to do it, and then you're going to have a strip center with 10 cars parked in front of it. So that's what
Yeah.
we're trying to avoid.
Well, thanks
there.
for clarifying, but I mean, just great job. I know you've put a tremendous amount of time and effort into this. I think you've got a real nice finished product.
Mr. Chairman,
Please.
I move to continue this public hearing for the 2018 Land Development Code Amendment to Section 6-307 signs to the May 8th, 2018 Plan Commission meeting.
Second. Second.
Motion made and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
There are no nays. All right, Brother Mitch, it's your last stop,
Oh, yeah, good luck.
Texas.
Texas.
Everybody here, I'm sure, will convey the same thing. Good luck, best of luck to you. Hope you succeed in whatever endeavors you take on. Texas is a good spot.
Thank you.
They have a
Big
lot
state,
of,
where in Texas?
McKinney,
McKinney,
north of Dallas. Yes.
that's
I
where
don't know.
Paul Grimes
I don't
is
know
the
if you've
village
heard of it.
manager. Did Paul steal you?
yes.
He did not. Nobody stole me. This was out of my own volition.
They have a lot more warm there than they do here, so I'm sure you'll like it.
So Paul claims that he doesn't know anything about it.
Best of luck to you, Mitch.
Yes.
Thank you.
luck.
Thank you for everything. It's been fantastic working with and for you guys. And it's been great working in a place that allowed me to learn to become a planner and expand my knowledge and experience. So.
Again, bravo.
Good luck.
Bravo.
This meeting's adjourned at 8:26. Thank you. I didn't know signs were there. You know what my favorite sign is? Well, Peace Brothers and Sisters. Oh, no, that's was a thick jacket.
I'm sorry? So I do work, right now I'm working on a project, with Simon, there, so I do.
Do me a favor.
Forgot the last slide.
103 stories. 2,400. Thank you.